52 contracts, 3 ruthless clauses, and one woman brave enough to challenge an entire system. Jasmine Crockett walked into the courtroom alone. No assistant, no security, armed only with the evidence and a truth buried for 6 years. She didn't just expose a billion-dollar scam. She silenced an entire courtroom. So what exactly turned a seemingly small trial into the spark that shook America to its core? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air outside was heavy, thick with heat and silence, as Jasmine Crockett stepped through the glass doors of the GW County Courthouse. She carried no entourage, no press behind her, no polished team of junior attorneys. Just one worn leather case in her hand, and the kind of determination that doesn't bend, even when the ground does. Her strides were sharp, heels cracking against the marble like warning shots. She knew exactly where she was walking, into the belly of a system that had crushed others before her. Not because they were wrong, but because they weren't powerful. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to confront. Then she saw him. Back row, left corner. Noah Hartley, slouched low in his seat, wearing a tan blazer like a poor disguise, his fingers clasped too tightly, knuckles pale. The man who once risked his career to send her classified files now sat like a ghost in hiding. Their eyes met only for a second, but in that second everything was said. His stare wasn't cold, it was warning. It said, "They don't lose here, Jasmine. Be ready." She gave the faintest nod. No fear, no doubt, just resolve. She barely had time to finish registering Noah's quiet warning when the real show began. The courtroom doors creaked open again, not with hesitation, but with practiced flair. Grant Lasker entered like a man stepping onto a stage he'd built himself. He didn't walk. He glided, like a man used to having the floor before he even opened his mouth. His eyes found Jasmine instantly, and then came the smirk. The kind that wasn't just dismissive, but deeply amused by the fact that she'd shown up at all. He took a moment to enjoy the optics. Her, standing alone. Him, flanked by 2 junior associates in expensive suits carrying files they probably hadn't read. Lasker tilted his head slightly, and his voice, silky, smug, unmistakably rehearsed, cut through the silence. Well, I thought you'd finally retired." No response. Jasmine stood still. Still delivering those grandstanding speeches? The kind that get headlines but never hold up in court? What is it today? Another sob story about people who didn't read what they signed? A few soft chuckles rippled from the gallery. Nothing loud, but enough. It wasn't humor. It was ritual. They'd seen this play out before. The smooth corporate lawyer against the idealist who thought she could fight the system with integrity and a binder full of facts. "You're really going to try and tear down a multi-million-dollar contract with feelings?" Lasker said almost to himself. "Brave. Delusional. But brave." Still, Jasmine said nothing. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She let him finish his show. The side door to the bench opened, and the courtroom shifted again, this time into silence. Judge Harold Thornwell entered with the weight of tradition behind him. Tall, lean, dressed in robes darker than the mahogany panels lining the walls. He moved with the quiet authority of a man who believed deeply in order, but not always in justice. He took his seat slowly, adjusting his robe with care. When he spoke, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Be seated." Everyone obeyed. Lasker didn't bow. He nodded, just enough to signal that respect would be offered, but not freely given. Jasmine sat, her movements precise, her expression unreadable. Then the judge's eyes found her and paused. Just for a second too long. It was subtle but unmistakable. A shift of posture, a narrowing of his gaze. The message was clear, and it wasn't about procedure. It was about expectation. "Ms. Crockett," Thornwell said, tapping a finger lightly against the folder in front of him, "I trust you understand the gravity of this proceeding." Jasmine gave a slight nod. "Good. Then I also trust you'll keep your arguments within the bounds of reason and law. This court has no interest in grandstanding or theatrics." A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. Lasker smirked again. This wasn't a warning. It was a leash, slipped on before the trial even started. We wouldn't want this to turn into a spectacle, Thornwell added, more to the room than to her. The words hung there, dry but deliberate, a warning disguised as neutrality. Jasmine had heard it before, in courtrooms that looked different but acted the same. Don't raise your voice. Don't stir the room. Don't challenge the way things work. This wasn't about tone, it was about control, about telling her exactly how far she was allowed to go before it became too much. She didn't flinch when the judge questioned her. She didn't rise to Lasker's bait. Jasmine Crockett had stood in rooms like this before, built to elevate power, designed to humiliate anyone who didn't wear the right suit, carry the right name, or speak in the right tone. But today she wasn't here to posture, she was here to dismantle. And the first crack in the foundation was ready. She rose from her seat without ceremony, no dramatic pause, no flourish, and walked to the evidence cart with steady, measured steps. The moment she opened her case, the room began to shift. No one moved, but the atmosphere tightened. Jasmine pulled out a thick black binder, corners frayed, spine slightly torn, edges marked by months of war room work and sleepless nights. 52 contracts were inside, signed by real people with real savings, and most of them had no idea they'd been walking into a financial trap. She laid the binder on the evidence cart, the soft thud loud in the silence, and spoke with the calm force of someone who knew exactly where the bones were buried. These are the investment agreements issued by Seaside Capital over the last 6 years. No theatrics, just facts. She flipped to the first colored tab, read, and pressed a button on the remote in her hand. A document flashed onto the projector screen, crisp and formal. Clause 14B, the company reserves the right to adjust annual service fees based on projected market trends. She didn't speak right away. She let the clause sit in the air, just long enough for the jury to read it twice. Then, with surgical calm, she began to cut. On paper, this sounds standard, logical even. Who wouldn't expect fees to shift with the market? That's when Lasker saw his opening. Still seated, he leaned slightly forward, voice calm but calculated, just loud enough for the jury to hear, soft enough to sound reasonable. Fee adjustments are standard in financial services, Ms. Crockett. He didn't look at her. He looked at the jury, like he was explaining something to a group of students. A few heads nodded slightly. His tone was mild, but his intent was clear. Paint Jasmine as someone stirring drama over standard procedure. But she didn't blink. If it were standard, she said, turning slowly toward him, you wouldn't have to fake the math. Then she clicked the remote again. The screen behind her shifted. Gone were the polished contract excerpts. Now the courtroom was staring at raw internal Seaside data, grainy PDFs, draft spreadsheets, emails between executives with subject lines like, build a model to match fee target. A graph appeared, bright lines rising steadily, not tied to inflation or real markets, but to arbitrary figures written weeks before any projection was finalized. Jasmine stepped aside, letting the jury see it all. This, she pointed, is Clause 14B's backbone. Homemade charts, self-made data, and emails directing analysts to make sure the numbers justify the fee hikes, not the other way around. She raised the binder in one hand and motioned toward the screen with the other. These are the trends. This is what Clause 14B is really based on. Not the economy, not inflation, not the market, just spreadsheets made in-house with no oversight. In some cases, she flipped to another page. The trend data was finalized after the fees were increased. A murmur rippled across the jury box. One man leaned forward. A woman glanced at her notes. Jasmine's tone sharpened. Not louder, just harder. In plain terms, Seaside made up their own numbers, then used those numbers to justify charging their clients more. She took another step, closer to the jury now, holding up one contract. One client was charged a 22% service fee increase in a year when the market had a 4% gain. Why? Because Seaside's internal model said so. That's it. No explanation. No appeal. Behind her, Lasker sat up straighter, jaw clenched. The smirk was gone. His pen tapped the table once, sharply, then stopped. Jasmine kept going. They built a system where they can raise your costs whenever they want, and they wrapped it in language that looks professional, Sounds legitimate, but is designed to hide the trap in plain sight. Lasker's mouth tightened. He didn't speak. His pen hovered above his legal pad, then dropped flat. His eyes flicked to the screen again, then to the judge. For the first time, his face had a wrinkle of something new. Concern. Clause 14, B had shown the trick, but Clause 22C showed the cruelty. Jasmine returned to the cart, flipped to the next tab, and held up a second binder, smaller but heavier in weight, not just in pages but in what it carried. Now we move to Clause 22C, she said. It states, clients who withdraw funds before maturity may be subject to administrative penalties. Her tone turned sharper, cold steel, without raising a decibel. This is where the real damage happens. Not in theory, not in numbers, in lives. She pulled out a folder marked Ellis J. and placed it beside the projector. James Ellis, she said, worked 27 years as a union electrician, invested $72,000 into a seaside retirement account. Then his wife was diagnosed with terminal cancer. No insurance coverage for the only treatment that gave her a chance. A slide appeared on the screen. James and his wife in a hospital room, smiling weakly. A few people in the courtroom shifted. The image wasn't dramatic. It was honest. Human. James did what any husband would do. He asked for his money back. She clicked the remote. The next slide showed the payout. A single figure. $117.43. A gasp. Someone in the gallery whispered, "What?" Jasmine didn't move. After Seaside's penalties, this is what they gave him. She stared at the jury. That's not financial policy. That's robbery, written in legalese. Grant Lasker, who had remained still until now, let out a short laugh. Dry, defensive. He stood, pretending calm. Your Honor, these are emotionally charged stories with no bearing on the legality of the contracts. But Jasmine cut in, voice like a scalpel. You want to talk legality? Let's show them the contract. She clicked again, pulling up James Ellis's agreement. The document loaded. 1 page, 2, 3. Then she froze. Clause 22C was missing. It had been there. It was always there. But now on the courtroom projector, it was gone. Jasmine clicked again. Back, forward, nothing. She didn't flinch. Your Honor, I request verification. The digital document has been altered. A thick pause filled the room. Even the air seemed to slow. Thornwell signaled the bailiff, who quickly retrieved the printed file. The judge flipped to the correct section. Page 9, section 22, C. Clauses present in the original, he said flatly, but missing from the projection. Lasker sat down slowly. The smirk was gone. He didn't speak, but his fingers gripped the edge of the table. White knuckles, a twitch in the jaw. Jasmine turned to the jury. Her voice didn't tremble. It struck like a hammer. This wasn't a glitch. This is how they operate. Write the fine print to destroy you, then make it vanish when the courtroom lights come on. She pointed to the screen, now blank where 22 degrees Celsius should be. They don't write contracts to explain. They write them to trap. They don't call it theft, but they take everything. The gallery was silent. One juror stared straight ahead, stunned. Another shook his head, visibly angry. $170 from $72,000, Jasmine repeated, and now they want to pretend the clause never existed. She locked eyes with Lasker. He looked away. There are names behind these papers, she said. Families, patients, people who trusted them. Then to the judge softly, and someone tried to erase the evidence of that pain, right here, in this courtroom. For a long moment, no one said a word. Even the judge's pen stopped moving. And in that silence, Jasmine had done what Lasker feared most. She'd made the jury care. The courtroom had already shifted. The jury was no longer watching Jasmine with curiosity. They were watching her with intent. Something had cracked, but Jasmine wasn't there to break illusions. She was there to shatter them. She returned to the binder, fingers now moving faster, her voice gaining quiet momentum like a rising wave. So far, we've seen how they invented trends to charge more. We've seen how they erased evidence from the record. She looked at the jury, eyes burning, not with rage, but with something more dangerous: clarity. Now let's follow the money. She flipped to a navy tab marked 31A. A new clause appeared on the screen. Clause 31A. The company shall not be liable for market-driven losses. She let the words hang in the air. They sounded neutral, almost dull. It's written to feel familiar, she said, to seem safe. You hear market loss, and you think, well, that's just the risk of investing, right? She turned to the jury. Some nodded slowly, unconsciously. That's how it worked. Jasmine clicked the remote again. But what if I told you there was no market involved? The screen shifted. This time it wasn't just documents. It was a visual web, a digital blueprint, a detailed flow chart with arrows connecting 23 shell companies, layered across 4 countries: Delaware, Panama, Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands, each node marked by initials, each arrow a pathway for client funds. The jury stared. What you're looking at is a real-time audit trail, Jasmine said. These are shell companies, legally formed, virtually empty. Their only purpose? To receive, move, and hide Seaside's client money. She pointed to one node. Here's where a client's funds enter, labeled as Diversified Portfolio. It goes to Holding Trust A. From there, it's transferred to Axis Strategic LP, then to Argos Group Ltd., a private equity firm with no listed employees and no physical office. Click. The next slide, a luxury yacht, 74 feet, mahogany decks, private dock, registered under Argos Group Limited. This yacht is registered to one of those firms, and that firm, she paused, turning to the jury, is 51% owned by Seaside's chief operating officer. You could hear the breath leave the room. So when they told you your money was invested in the market, what they meant was, it was building toys. For them. Behind her, Grant Lasker stiffened. This is misleading. You're implying criminal activity without proof. Jasmine didn't even turn to him. No, I'm not implying. I'm showing. She clicked again. Now. Wire transfers. Date stamped. Matching client withdrawals with funds hitting shell companies. Days before those same clients were told their accounts had underperformed. She stepped forward. One client was told her $40,000 had lost value due to market instability. The same week, $39,800 from her account landed in a firm that bought a villa in Mallorca, registered to a Seaside executive's spouse. Lasker stood up now, frustrated. You're twisting connections, building conspiracy theories. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She just turned toward him, finally, and said, You want to talk about theories? Let's talk about ownership filings, about property registries, about tax records. You can twist words in a contract, Mr. Lasker, but you can't untwist a wire transfer. She stepped directly between the jury and the screen, commanding the room. Clause 31A was their shield. It let them say, sorry, it's the market, while their executives were holding champagne on the French Riviera. They hid behind the language of risk to justify theft with a signature. Click. Now the screen showed a quote from a Seaside internal email. As long as it's routed through 2 layers, no one will trace it back. Legal reviewed it. We're fine. Jasmine's voice cut through the silence. They built a machine, not to grow your money, but to make it disappear legally, to protect themselves with language, while bleeding you dry. She stepped closer to the jury box now. They told you your money was in stocks, bonds, real estate, but it was in speedboats, villas, wine cellars, and they wrote contracts like Clause 31A to make sure you never knew. One juror covered his mouth. Another woman stared down at her lap, fists clenched. In the gallery, a retired man leaned forward with tears in his eyes. He'd once invested with Seaside. They didn't lose your money, Jasmine said. They took it, then blamed the market. She walked back to the screen, arms by her sides, voice barely above a whisper. This wasn't just business. It was betrayal, legalized. Lasker had nothing left to say. His hand was shaking now, the pen tapping out silent panic on the legal pad before him. He glanced to the judge, then down again, saying nothing. And Jasmine, she stood still, calm, precise. They told you it was volatility, but really it was greed, dressed in paperwork, hidden behind a clause. And for the first time, no one in the courtroom, not even the judge, dared to breathe. But the charts weren't the end of it. Jasmine hadn't come to show what they did. She came to prove why they did it. As the final flowchart faded from the screen, the courtroom was already reeling. Jurors stared in stunned silence. Lasker's pen had stopped moving. Even Judge Thornwell leaned back slightly, expression unreadable, but no longer indifferent. And then Jasmine reached for a red folder. It was thinner than the others, but more dangerous. Labeled simply, Confidential, Seaside Internal. Her hand didn't tremble as she held it up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm, "I'm submitting one final document for the court's review. This was provided by a former Seaside employee, verified by a third-party forensic firm." She walked it to the bailiff herself. No assistant, no ceremony, just truth, delivered like a warrant. The judge opened it, read the first page, stopped. On screen, Jasmine clicked the remote. The memo appeared, company letterhead at the top, time-stamped and addressed to Seaside's executive team. The subject line was plain: Client Communication Strategy, Q2 Revisions. She read aloud, Objective: maximize client confusion, delay disclosure timelines, minimize legal exposure. A collective inhale swept across the jury box. "These aren't my words," she said. "They're Seaside's." She advanced to the next slide, a screenshot of handwritten notes in the margin, scrawled by one of the firm's senior directors. "The less they understand," Jasmine read slowly, "the less they fight." She turned away from the screen and back toward the jury, voice cutting like glass. This wasn't bad policy. It wasn't mismanagement. It was a playbook. One juror dropped his pen. A woman blinked hard, stunned. In the gallery, someone whispered, "Unbelievable." Jasmine continued, "They weren't confused. They wanted you to be. They didn't fail to explain the fees. They worked to make sure you wouldn't understand them." The courtroom was still reeling from the memo, its language sharp, its intent undeniable. Jasmine had laid bare a blueprint of manipulation, and for a moment, it felt like nothing could stop the truth from roaring through the walls of that courthouse. Until a voice broke the silence, hesitant, uneven, from the back row. "Your Honor, if I may." Heads turned. Jasmine froze mid-step. Her eyes snapped to the gallery, and there he was, Noah Hartley, the whistleblower, the man who had leaked the memo, the man who had asked for anonymity, for protection, the man who said they'd threatened him once and could do it again. Now he stood, hands wringing nervously, face pale, voice soft but shaking the foundation of the room. Some of those phrases," he said slowly, "might have been internal jokes, taken out of context, nothing ever officially implemented." The courtroom stiffened. The jury blinked. Lasker looked up with new interest. And Jasmine? She stood completely still, lips parted slightly, as if the oxygen had left the air. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it could have cut steel. "Noah," she said, "what are you doing?" He didn't meet her eyes. I just think it's important they understand," he stammered, gesturing weakly toward the memo on the screen. It wasn't necessarily company policy, just ideas. Not everything was serious." A low gasp from someone in the jury box. One juror leaned back like he'd just been slapped. Another crossed her arms tight, jaw clenched. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was a slow, sharp knife in the spine, delivered not by an enemy, but by a supposed ally. Jasmine stepped forward once. Her eyes locked on Noah's, willing him to look back. He didn't. "You gave me that memo. You said they were building walls of confusion on purpose. You said you were tired of watching people get ruined." Still, he looked away. And then Jasmine saw it. A woman seated 2 rows behind him. Sharp black suit, stern face. Someone who hadn't been there earlier. She gave Noah the faintest nod, and Jasmine understood. They got to him. He had flipped, in front of everyone. And the weight of that betrayal didn't just fall on her. It fell on every person who had trusted her to speak for them. But Jasmine didn't step back. She didn't fold. She turned slowly to the jury, her voice steady, sharp, unshaken. Whether or not Mr. Hartley chooses to remember his own words today, we have the time-stamped document. We have metadata. We have third-party verification of authorship, server location, and chain of custody. Her tone grew colder, measured, legal steel. Feelings can change, facts do not. And with that, the room snapped back into her gravity. Even with a knife in her back, Jasmine Crockett was still standing, still fighting, still winning. She didn't glare at Noah. She didn't even acknowledge Lasker's subtle smirk returning like a bruise beneath the surface. She turned to the judge with poise so deliberate it felt like a slow-motion reset of gravity. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I'd like to submit into evidence Exhibit 47, a verified forensic report of the internal Seaside memo in question." The bailiff moved toward her, but Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't wait. She had already retrieved the sealed folder, a slim, plastic-sleeved document marked with 3 words in red: timestamp, server, sender. She handed it over with the precision of someone presenting a weapon. This memo wasn't scribbled on a sticky note in a moment of frustration. It was drafted, revised, circulated, and digitally recorded on Seaside's own secure network. She turned and clicked the remote. The projector lit up with the first page of the digital forensics report. It was clinical, stark, precise, not dramatic, just undeniable. The metadata appeared line by line on the screen. Document title: Client Communication Strategy, Q2 created by noah.hartley@seasidecorp.com. Server path SCN- file 01 /internal /memos / confidential time created 4:43 a.m. EST date 3 weeks before this hearing. File hash SHA 256. Verified transmission logs. Verified by Digital Trace Forensics. Jasmine stepped back just enough for the jury to see her face beside the screen. This document has been authenticated by a third-party digital forensic firm, not an intern, not a friend of mine, a licensed, court-recognized digital tracing team with no stake in this trial. She turned to the jurors. Every email leaves a signature. Every file leaves a fingerprint. And this one, she gestured to the screen, it's not just signed, it's sealed by the system itself. The judge leaned forward now. Even Lasker had gone silent. "When Mr. Hartley gave me this memo," Jasmine continued, her voice razor-sharp but unwavering, "he didn't just hand over words, he handed over intent." She clicked again. The next slide appeared, a log of the memo's version history. 7 versions were saved over 4 days. The final one was emailed internally to 11 Seaside executives. The distribution list was extracted from the header. The hash matches across devices. There is no question where this came from, no question who created it, and no question what it meant. She let that hang, long enough for the gravity to settle. Then she walked toward the center of the courtroom, slow and steady. They didn't just lie to their clients. They lied in writing, digitally, repeatedly. She paused, her next words lower, harder. "And now they want you to believe it was all just a misunderstanding, a joke, something taken out of context." She walked closer to the jury box, eyes locking with one juror after the next. "But code doesn't make jokes. Servers don't laugh. Metadata doesn't have a sense of humor." Click. The final slide appeared. The full memo overlaid with notes from the digital trace audit. At the bottom, a highlighted line, handwritten, circled twice. Confuse, delay, deny, repeat. The jury's reaction was visceral. One woman covered her mouth. A man leaned forward with his hands clasped tight, knuckles white. Another sat back, stone-faced, his jaw ticking. Jasmine's voice cut through the thick silence. "That wasn't sarcasm. That was strategy." Lasker looked like he wanted to object, but didn't. He knew better now. The judge hadn't looked at him once. Jasmine took one last step toward the screen, then turned back to the courtroom and delivered the final blow. "Intent leaves a trail." and trails don't lie. No one breathed. She wasn't just presenting evidence anymore. She was cutting through decades of legal deception with the precision of a scalpel and the weight of a sledgehammer, and there was nothing left for them to hide behind. For a moment, time seemed to fracture inside that courtroom. The hum of the projector had gone silent. The rustle of papers, the shuffle of feet, even the breath of the audience, all stilled. The air itself felt like it was holding a verdict. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett stood motionless, not as a performer soaking in applause, but as a woman who had dragged the truth across a battlefield of lies and dared the system to look at it. Judge Thornwell sat still for a long moment. No expression, no motion, just his eyes scanning the final page of the forensic report Jasmine had laid bare for all to see. The weight of years, of privilege, of protection, of institutional blindness, rested across his shoulders like a robe too heavy to bear. He closed the folder slowly, leaned forward, folded his hands, and with a voice stripped of performance, he spoke, not like a man delivering lines, but like a man who had finally stopped lying to himself. "This court acknowledges the authenticity of the memo," he said, his voice dry but resolute. "The accompanying digital forensics report has been verified to this court's satisfaction. The motion to dismiss is formally denied." The words dropped like an iron door slamming shut. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It simply changed. Judge Thornwell's ruling still hovered in the air like smoke after a battlefield cannon. The courtroom remained frozen in that split second between disbelief and realization. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't shift her weight or drop her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, the glow of the projector still catching the edge of her binder like a soft halo. Behind her, across the aisle, Grant Lasker was stone. He hadn't made a sound in minutes. His pen had fallen silent. The legal pad before him, once filled with practiced rebuttals and smug annotations, was now blank with defeat. He stared at it, not reading, not writing, just staring, like a man searching for a strategy and realizing he had none left. His hands trembled slightly, just enough for the closest reporter to notice and pause her typing. There were no objections now, no cross-examinations, just silence, the kind that swallows power whole. And then a new sound, barely audible, but deeply human. The creak of a wooden bench, followed by the subtle scrape of worn soles against the marble floor. An elderly woman stood. She wore a modest gray blouse, pressed slacks, and a string of pearls that had seen better decades. Her hair was neat, her eyes wet. Her name was Marlene Dwyer, a retired public school teacher. Seaside Capital had emptied her pension after promising low-risk diversification. She had once sold her piano to afford groceries, and now at the back of courtroom 3B she stood, hand pressed over her heart, lips trembling with something too large for language. Next to her, a man rose, a Vietnam veteran, clean-shaven, jaw clenched. His name was Robert Mallory. He had invested everything after his second heart surgery, told it was protected capital. When the market shifted, Seaside blamed global volatility, but Jasmine had just shown otherwise, and Robert too stood, not in protest, not in anger, in recognition. And then another, and another. A factory worker who had driven 2 hours to be here. A young woman whose father had lost his life savings before losing his will to fight. A nurse who had taken extra shifts to cover the penalties Seaside charged her for early withdrawal. No one applauded, no one chanted. This wasn't a rally. This was something far more sacred. They stood with their hands before them, some pressed to chests, others clasped tightly together, because something had shifted in the walls of that courtroom. Jasmine hadn't just won a ruling. She had cracked open the air, and in that opening, their dignity stepped forward for the first time in years. A few reporters, trained to spot moments worth headlines, lowered their cameras. One whispered, "Let them have it." The other simply nodded. A murmur moved like a breeze through the room. Not words, not noise, just breath. The kind of shared exhale that happens when people finally feel seen. And Jasmine, she didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She felt it. The presence behind her was no longer the silence of forgotten victims. It was the weight of people standing tall again. For years, they had been pushed aside by fine print, brushed off by customer service scripts, and told their stories didn't matter because the contract said otherwise. But now they had risen, and they hadn't needed permission to do it. They were reclaiming the space that had been taken from them, not through shouts, but by standing. And in that courtroom, their silence was louder than any verdict. Jasmine finally let out a slow breath, not of exhaustion, but of resolve. The kind of breath you take after holding it for far too long. She was no longer just a lawyer with documents. She was a voice for the voiceless. And now the voiceless were answering back, with presence. Justice didn't slam a gavel that day. It rose, row by row. The courthouse doors swung open with a heavy groan, like an old structure exhaling after decades of silence. Jasmine Crockett stepped out, framed by stone columns now etched in the memory of everyone who had watched what happened inside. Her steps were steady, deliberate, not performative. Her heels clicked against the granite like punctuation marks after a truth no longer buried. The crowd had already gathered. They had been waiting. Word had spread like wildfire through digital veins. Something had shifted in courtroom 3B. Reporters lined the marble steps 5 deep, shoulder to shoulder, press badges flashing, lenses refocusing like scopes. Cameramen clung to shoulder rigs, their red lights blinking. The swarm moved as one, yet with the hunger of many. The questions flew before she'd even reached the microphones. Ms. Crockett, how long have you had this evidence? Will Seaside's executives be prosecuted individually? Was Noah Hartley coerced into reversing his testimony? Is this the beginning of a federal investigation? Do you plan to take this national? The air buzzed. Microphones shoved toward her like spears. Everyone wanted a headline, a quote, a crack in her armor. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't adjust the buttons on her suit. She didn't even touch the mic. She waited until the sounds swelled to the edge of chaos. And then, without raising her voice, without so much as a hand gesture, she spoke. Today we made the system stop and listen. 7 words, but they hit like a hammer on glass. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't move. For the first time all day, they simply went quiet. Because that wasn't a soundbite. It was a verdict. Behind her, the victims stepped out of the courthouse one by one. Not as plaintiffs, not as statistics, but as people who had been wronged and finally, visibly, unequivocally acknowledged. The retired teacher placed a hand on the courthouse rail, pausing to absorb the moment. The veteran from the 3rd row walked forward with eyes that no longer held shame. A single mom whose account had been gutted for early withdrawal penalties clutched her daughter's hand just a little tighter. They stood behind Jasmine, not for protection, but because she had stood for them. The reporters, always hungry, felt it too. One camera woman slowly lowered her rig. A young journalist in the back checked her recorder, not to ensure it captured the sound, but to make sure it captured the silence afterward, because that's what hit hardest. Jasmine didn't offer a second sentence. She didn't walk down the steps like a hero descending to applause. She simply nodded once to the crowd, then turned, not toward the flashing lights, but toward the rows of people behind her who had once been invisible. She walked beside them, not in front of them. A woman to her left whispered, "Thank you." Jasmine only replied, "We're not done." The marble beneath their feet reflected the sunlight and the moment. This wasn't closure, it was ignition. And from the edge of the sidewalk, a little boy, no older than 10, watched as the line of adults moved past him. His mother bent low to whisper something, but the boy just asked, "Mom, was that the woman who told the truth?" She nodded. Yes, and they heard her. The crowd had begun to thin. Reporters peeled off in pairs, chasing new leads, while court staff filtered back inside, their energy fading like echoes after a storm. But on the edge of the steps, a man remained, alone, unmoving. His name was Henry Lawson, 82 years old, retired union welder from Pittsburgh, Vietnam vet, twice widowed, once cheated out of the retirement he built with his bare hands. For decades, he had watched courtrooms from a distance, on TV, in newspapers, from the sidelines of America. Not once had he imagined he'd stand here in person, much less feel like something in that building. had finally turned around to face him. He stood with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, holding a crumpled beige cap that looked older than some of the reporters and now packing up their gear. His spine was bent with time, but his eyes, bloodshot heavy, were wide open, staring up at the courthouse's towering columns like they might speak. He didn't say much, but when he finally did, his voice sounded like gravel in memory. "For the first time," he murmured, eyes never leaving the stone, "I saw justice not turn its back." No one heard it at first. Not really. It wasn't said for a camera or a quote, or even for Jasmine. It was said the way you might speak to a ghost, or to the 25-year-old version of yourself still trapped in the past. The version who walked into a bank, signed the wrong form, and lost everything when no one was watching. Next to him, a young man in a bomber jacket shifted closer. His grandson, Jacob. He'd skipped work that day, insisted on coming. He didn't say anything now. He just watched his grandfather's face. Henry kept staring at the building. His chest rose slowly, uneven with age, but steady with something else. Recognition. This wasn't just about contracts or fees. It wasn't about who said what in a memo or when a server logged an IP address. It was about all the years men like him sat on hold, listened to corporate apologies, filled out forms that led nowhere, and watched polite letters from their lawyers disappear into systems that weren't built for people like them. And now someone had cracked that system open with nothing but truth and stood still long enough to be heard. "You remember things when you're my age," he said suddenly, almost startling Jacob. "Not all of them good, but this, I'll remember this." His eyes welled up again, not from pain this time, but from release, from finally seeing a courtroom where someone like him wasn't a statistic, where silence wasn't the final word. He exhaled long, like letting go of something he'd carried for years. The flags above the courthouse flapped gently. The sun caught the stone just right, and Henry, who'd seen too many winters, felt something bloom in his chest he hadn't known he still had. The feeling of being counted. Jasmine was already off the steps by then, walking with the others, but she turned once, just briefly, and caught his gaze. She didn't wave. She didn't nod. She just saw him. And in that glance, Henry felt it again. He wasn't on the outside anymore. Not today. Not this time. The courthouse had fallen silent, but across the country, the system began to shudder awake. It didn't happen all at once. The impact wasn't loud. Not at first. It started with a whisper in the legal underground. A junior analyst in Sacramento quietly flagged a file titled "Client Withdrawal Clause, Internal Draft." In Chicago, a paralegal stared at a familiar-sounding penalty structure in an old arbitration case and asked her boss, "Doesn't this look like what Jasmine Crockett exposed?" Then came the calls. Then came the files being reopened. Within 72 hours of Jasmine Crockett's final words echoing through courtroom 3B, legal teams in 5 states had already begun informal reviews of contracts tied to Seaside Capital and its affiliates. By the end of the week, it was 12 states. Old settlements were being re-examined. Dismissed lawsuits suddenly didn't seem so weak anymore. They seemed manipulated. In Colorado, the Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into systemic contract misrepresentation practices after one of Jasmine's exhibits was found to be nearly identical to a 2019 case that had been quietly settled under NDA. In North Carolina, a group of retirees filed a class action lawsuit against a local wealth management firm that had once licensed its contract templates from Seaside's legal department. And in Texas, a state court judge issued an emergency order demanding the preservation of internal emails and financial data from a banking conglomerate accused of hiding penalties through shell ventures. The same shell structure Jasmine had diagrammed on screen just days earlier. Jasmine's binder, the one with frayed corners and 52 contracts, was now circulating behind closed doors in legal circles as Exhibit 0. Attorneys began using her case as the framework for fighting back, citing her meticulous breakdowns and courtroom demonstrations as precedent for fraud by language. The phrase "engineered confusion" entered the legal vocabulary. Law school professors rewrote their syllabi. Journalists requested transcripts. Politicians, once dismissive, now asked, how many others got caught in the same net? Meanwhile, Seaside Capital's boardroom went into lockdown. Emergency strategy meetings were held in glass towers above Wall Street. One shareholder memo leaked to the press read simply, "This case was supposed to be containable. It is not." But Jasmine hadn't just exposed a corrupt company. She'd exposed the architecture of abuse, how corporations hide exploitation inside legality, how language can be made so dense, so carefully crafted, that even harm looks legitimate. And in doing so, she handed the public something they hadn't had in years, a clear blueprint of how power cheats when no one's looking. In Washington, D.C., a group of senators formed a bipartisan working group to examine potential reforms to financial disclosure laws. One of them, a former securities litigator, said bluntly in a press conference, "What Ms. Crockett revealed isn't just malpractice, it's manipulation disguised as policy." Behind the curtain, Seaside's senior legal counsel stepped down for health reasons. Their chief risk officer stopped appearing at board meetings. An internal audit leaked to Reuters revealed that nearly 38% of Seaside's discretionary fee increases over the past 5 years had no documented basis outside of proprietary internal models. The same phrase Jasmine had lit on fire in front of 12 stunned jurors. One of those jurors, an engineer named Reuben Caldwell, was later quoted saying, "They weren't adjusting fees to reflect the market. They were adjusting the market to justify their fees." And that right there was the moment the system snapped. Because Jasmine hadn't merely exposed fraud, she exposed design. She showed that the suffering was built in on purpose, that the fine print was engineered to confuse, that the contracts weren't broken. They were working exactly as intended, just not for the people who signed them. And once the country saw that, they couldn't unsee it. But the courtroom was just the beginning. The impact didn't end with one verdict, it multiplied. Within days, civil litigation firms across the country began citing Jasmine Crockett's case in their motions. Her courtroom transcripts became ammunition, a legal Rosetta Stone for decoding intentionally confusing contracts. What had once been dismissed as client error or insufficient documentation was now being reconsidered under a new legal lens. Deliberate obfuscation. In Minneapolis, a lawyer representing a group of teachers filed a motion to reopen discovery using Jasmine's testimony as direct precedent. In Atlanta, a judge who had once tossed a similar case without hearing it now demanded a full evidentiary review. Jasmine's strategy had rewritten the rules, and then the ripple hit Washington. Under mounting public pressure and a string of media exposés linking Seaside's schemes to a dozen other firms, Congress launched an internal inquiry. What began as a quiet committee review erupted into nationally televised hearings. A Republican senator from Utah and a Democrat from Maryland, once political adversaries, sat side by side holding a redacted internal memo Jasmine had introduced in court. Their eyes told the whole story. This wasn't politics anymore. It was accountability. "This memo," one of them said during the opening session, "was never supposed to be seen outside the boardroom, but now it belongs to the American people." Suddenly, financial regulation wasn't a background issue. It was front-page news. The House Subcommittee on Financial Integrity voted unanimously to conduct a full audit of contract enforcement practices at major investment firms. The language Jasmine had exposed, phrases like internal discretion, dynamic fee modeling, and subject to proprietary benchmarks, became red flags. Lawmakers began circulating draft legislation to ban contract clauses that allowed companies to both define and enforce their own market trends. And behind the closed doors of Seaside Capital, panic spread like fire. By week's end, 3 high-ranking executives, 2 vice presidents, and the chief operating officer were subpoenaed for federal testimony. Their offshore assets were frozen by court order. A Delaware judge issued an emergency injunction preventing Seaside from deleting internal communications flagged in Jasmine's forensic report. The message was unmistakable. For the first time in years, the system was punching back. But it wasn't doing so from the top down. It was doing it because one woman refused to sit down when the rules were stacked against her. And then the letters started coming. At first, it was 1 or 2, neatly typed, politely worded. "Dear Ms. Crockett, I watched your testimony. I believe my bank used the same kind of clause. Then came the emails. Dozens, hundreds. People from small towns, forgotten cities, quiet suburbs, all writing to say, I think what happened to me might not be my fault. In Missouri, a retired postal worker sent a scanned document with shaky handwriting in the margins. They said it was a fee for market fluctuation. Now I see it was something else. A school nurse in Nevada wrote, they told me I should have read the fine print better. But after watching you, I realized maybe they designed it so I wouldn't. By the end of the month, Jasmine's office had to assign 3 full-time staffers just to sort through the flood of correspondence. They came by mail, by fax, in crumpled envelopes with no return address. Some were heartbreaking, others were furious, but all of them shared the same pulse: relief. Relief that someone had finally named the thing they'd felt for years but couldn't describe: the shame of being swindled, and the silence that followed. One message stood out more than most. It was handwritten, no punctuation, from a widower in West Virginia who had lost his retirement savings. I thought I was stupid. Watching you in court made me realize I was just too trusting. You made me feel like that's not a crime. Jasmine read it twice. Then she sat back, her eyes fixed on the wall, not in pride but in grief, because she understood the cost of that silence, the way people blame themselves for being misled, the way systems are designed not only to steal, but to convince you it was your fault for letting them. And now, for the first time in years, people were speaking up. They weren't asking for favors. They were demanding investigations, requesting audits, sending copies of contracts to regulators, local reporters, financial advisors, anyone who would listen. They were organizing Facebook groups and church meetups to talk about the dangers of customized investment clauses. People who had never stepped into a courtroom were quoting Jasmine Crockett word for word. They didn't build contracts, they built cages. What started in one courtroom had become a nationwide awakening. The walls weren't just cracking anymore. They were falling. But it didn't stop at letters. It swelled. The courthouse may have set the stage, but the real verdict came from living rooms, kitchen tables, and front porches across the country. Jasmine Crockett's case cracked open something deeper than fraud. It touched something that had been festering for years: the belief that ordinary people had no voice. And when she stood, they stood. When she spoke, they remembered how to speak for themselves. In just 2 weeks, her office received more than 400 handwritten letters. They came from elementary school teachers in Indiana, night shift nurses in Baltimore, crosstown bus drivers in Oakland. One envelope from a veteran in Mississippi contained his folded discharge papers and a note that read, "I fought for a country that told me to read the fine print. Turns out they buried the knife in it." Another from a young single mom said simply, "I thought I was the only one who felt stupid. You made me feel human again." Some came with contracts, some came with tears. One came with nothing at all, just the words, "Thank you for not flinching," when they tried to scare you. And in every voice, one theme rang louder than ever before. They were done being quiet. People who once blamed themselves began to question the system. People who had never filed a complaint in their lives were now calling their attorneys general. Citizens who had never spoken at a town hall were organizing local forums. They didn't need a title or a degree or a podium. They had the truth, and the truth was contagious. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. She didn't just pull back the curtain, she handed the curtain to the people and said, "Tear it down yourselves." And they did. Justice didn't stay inside courtroom walls. It spilled into conversations, into small towns, into late-night discussions between spouses who wondered if their retirement savings had been gamed, into pastors' sermons, into barbershops. It became a fire too big to smother, because justice isn't just about law, it's about dignity. And when someone reminds you that you deserve it, you don't forget. And so, while the nation buzzed with headlines and congressional hearings, Jasmine Crockett chose a different battlefield. Not the Capitol, not a courtroom, but a rundown community center in the forgotten grid of East Cleveland. There were no polished floors or robed judges here, just old linoleum tile, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, and a half-broken clock on the back wall that blinked the wrong time. The folding chairs weren't arranged in rows of authority. They were clustered in circles of trust. It smelled of instant coffee and old paperbacks. And yet, it felt like something sacred was about to begin. Jasmine arrived early, no entourage, no suit jacket, just a black turtleneck, rolled sleeves, and a stack of battered manila folders clutched against her side like evidence she couldn't let go. She paused at the door for a moment, taking in the space, the faces, the way people shifted in their chairs when they saw her. Not out of reverence, but out of disbelief, because they had never expected her to come here, and she knew that. The room was filled with the kinds of people who never got invited to financial literacy seminars. Warehouse workers, bus drivers, single mothers, pensioners who had once trusted too easily and paid for it. One woman held her mortgage file in a worn grocery bag. A man near the window had printed out his IRA statements and underlined every line he didn't understand. They weren't dressed for court. They weren't trained in legalese, but they were here because Jasmine had stood up in front of power and made them believe maybe they could too. She walked to the front of the room. No podium, just a collapsible table, a whiteboard behind her, and a dry erase marker she grabbed from a chipped plastic cup. Then she said it, not like a lawyer, but like a neighbor. Today's not about me. It's about getting your power back. She held up one of the seaside contracts and let it fall open onto the table with a soft thud that cut through the silence. We're going to take this apart. Not so you can file a lawsuit, so no one ever tricks you again. A murmur of agreement moved through the room. Some leaned forward, others just held their breath. Then she handed out red pens. The air inside the room was still, heavy with the weight of old doubts and new hope. Jasmine didn't pace, didn't perform. She stood anchored, feet planted, eyes steady, at the front of the room. In her hand, held high, was the very same seaside capital contract that had once gutted the savings of hundreds, including some sitting right in front of her. The paper was bent at the edges, worn from courtroom battle, but now it looked more like a weapon than a document. "This is the exact contract we exposed in court," she said, her voice calm but hard as steel. "But we're not here to listen to me explain it. We're going to read it, line by line, together." The room held its breath as she reached into a small cardboard box beside her and began walking down the aisles. One by one, she handed out red pens. Simple, plastic, $1 red pens that suddenly felt heavier than any gavel. An older man looked at his pen like it was something sacred. A young woman in scrubs held hers in the air like a badge. A teenager whispered to his grandmother, "We're really doing this?" Jasmine returned to the front, picked up her own pen, and clicked it open. "Clause 14B, she said. "Let's circle it." There was a pause, a sound of paper rustling, pens uncapping, minds awakening. "Now," she continued, "this clause says, the company reserves the right to adjust annual service fees based on projected market trends." She looked up. "We're going to break this down. Not as lawyers, as people who've earned the right to understand where our money goes." The energy in the room shifted. Eyes narrowed. Pens hovered. Jasmine walked to the whiteboard and wrote the clause in bold letters. Then she underlined 3 words. Reserves the right. That means they can, but it never says when, or why, or how much. That's not protection. That's a trap. A man in the back raised his hand. "They told me that clause was standard," he said. "I thought I was just being paranoid." Jasmine turned to him, her voice clear. "You weren't paranoid. You were outnumbered." She circled the next phrase. Projected market trends. "And guess what?" she said. "Those trends weren't from the real market. They were made up, just like in the courtroom." The room started to shift again, not in sound, but in posture. Shoulders squared, brows furrowed. Every eye on Jasmine now held the same glint. This isn't a lecture. This is war. But this time, they weren't unarmed. They had red pens. And for the first time in a long time, they had each other. And as the red pens moved across paper, something extraordinary began to happen. People started asking questions, not with shame, but with fire. A bus driver raised his hand and pointed to a paragraph labeled, Penalty assessment criteria. This part right here, this is where they got me, isn't it? Jasmine walked over, looked at the circled line and nodded. Exactly. That's where they told you it was a maintenance fee when it was really a backdoor penalty. Another woman, a retired teacher, leaned over her document. I never knew that line meant they could take my money even if I followed the rules. Her voice cracked. I thought I'd messed up. Jasmine crouched beside her, not above her, but next to her, and said, No, they built it that way, and no one explained it because they didn't want you to fight back. Around the room, jaws clenched, pens tapped, hands rose. They weren't confused anymore. For years, these people had been told to sign and not question. They were made to feel stupid if they asked, made to feel difficult if they hesitated. But now, under flickering lights in a community center that smelled like old glue and civic hope, they were tearing apart a document that had once silenced them. Line by line, word by word. Jasmine didn't speak like a professor or a politician. She translated legalese into plain truth. Every clause she broke down became a torch passed from her hands to theirs. She showed them where the traps lived, where the contradictions hid, where the language curled around itself like a snake made of polite deception. Legal power shouldn't be locked away behind credentials, she said. It should be a common language, like first aid, like fire drills, like freedom. The crowd was no longer passive. They were circling clauses with confidence. They were flipping pages and pointing out red flags. They were, for the first time in their lives, reading contracts without fear. They weren't waiting for permission to understand. They were claiming their right to clarity, and Jasmine watched them, her eyes burning not with rage but with resolve. They wanted you to think you needed a lawyer to stand up. But sometimes all you need is a pen and a little truth. And then it happened, quietly, simply, but with the force of something sacred. The crowd had begun to gather their things. The room was buzzing with side conversations, quiet tears, and pages now full of red ink. But one man, gray-haired, shoulders slightly hunched, a W. Woodward veteran's pin on his cap, stood frozen in place. Jasmine noticed him. She didn't move. She let him come to her. He walked slowly, gripping a folded contract in one hand and his red pen in the other like a torch he never thought he'd be allowed to hold. When he stopped in front of her, his voice was gravel but steady. I didn't think I could ever understand this stuff, he said. All my life I let people in ties tell me what things meant, and I just nodded. But now? He paused. I don't think I'm scared of it anymore. The room went still again. Jasmine blinked, her chest rising once, then falling slow. She didn't smile. She nodded. Not the nod of approval, but the nod of recognition, from one fighter to another. He gently placed the contract on the table and whispered, Thank you for making people like me feel like we weren't stupid. Just left out. That was the moment. Not the courtroom, not the ruling, not even the headlines. This, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't come here to inspire headlines. She hadn't come here to launch a campaign or charm a camera crew or claim some hero spotlight. She had come with a binder, a red pen, and a truth too long hidden. And in doing so, she had given something back that no bill could ever legislate. Dignity. She never ran for office. She never held a press conference. She just kept showing up in church basements, school auditoriums, union halls, shelters, and retirement centers. She built no empire. She left no statue. But what she left behind was far more enduring. A blueprint for justice that ordinary people could carry in their hands. Because justice, she knew, was never a destination. It was a relay. A fire passed from hand to hand, story to story, truth to truth. And as she packed up her materials that night, just a box of papers and a heart full of worn names, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel powerful. She felt useful, and that was enough. Outside, the wind picked up across the Cleveland streets. People stepped out beneath the yellow glow of street lamps, still clutching their red pens like keys to a door no one had told them they could unlock. Jasmine looked up once, to the sky, then turned back to the community center and whispered to herself, We don't need to win every courtroom. We just need to keep the truth alive. And in that moment, It no longer belonged to the courts. It belonged to the people. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Just for being 5 minutes late, Jasmine Crockett was slammed with a $500 fine by a Texas judge, right in front of the entire courtroom. No chance to speak, no chance to explain. But the very next day, that same judge was brought down and faced 15 years in prison for systemic abuse of power. And from the moment one woman stood up against injustice, the entire Texas judicial system began to shake. So what really happened inside that silent courtroom? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courthouse in downtown Dallas wasn't just a building. It was a monument to fear, built brick by brick through decades of whispered warnings and buried complaints. Locals had a name for Courtroom 3B, Pearson's Pit. It was a place where young public defenders were chewed up and spit out, where first-time offenders walked in hopeful and walked out humiliated. Conversations happened only in murmurs. No one ever laughed. The only voice that mattered here belonged to Judge Harold Pearson, and everyone knew, once he took the bench, even the clock ticked quieter. It was 9:35 a.m. when the silence cracked open. The double oak doors creaked, then swung wide with authority. Jasmine Crockett stepped inside, her presence cutting through the stagnant air like a cold wind. Her heels clicked, not like a warning, but like a statement. She had arrived late, 5 minutes, because 15 minutes before, her secure phone line had rung with a red-tagged alert. Urgent call from House Oversight Committee. The report concerned allegations of systemic beatings in a private prison near Navarro County. Men screamed through walls while guards turned up the radio. She couldn't ignore it. She didn't. But in this room, explanations had no currency. The moment Jasmine Crockett crossed the threshold of Courtroom 3B, the tension in the air thickened like fog before a storm. Her entrance, though composed and respectful, was met not with the quiet professionalism of a fair judiciary, but with the icy silence of a place waiting to pounce. She was 5 minutes late. Just 5. Not enough to derail a docket, not enough to cause real disruption, but in this room, 5 minutes was the fuse Pearson had been waiting to light. From his perch above the courtroom, Judge Harold Pearson adjusted his glasses slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he's about to unleash something rehearsed. His eyes narrowed with a look that wasn't surprise. It was satisfaction. He had already decided who Jasmine Crockett was before she ever said a word. "I see punctuality isn't a concern for Washington royalty," Pearson said coldly, not addressing her, but declaring it to the room like a punchline meant to humiliate. His voice boomed with that unmistakable cadence of someone used to being obeyed, not questioned. He didn't give her a chance to respond. 5 minutes late may not mean much where you're from, but here it means disrespect. Then he turned directly to her, his expression flat, yet filled with disdain. "And I do not tolerate disrespect." The words echoed longer than they should have, as if the room itself recoiled. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Slow, measured, public. This wasn't a judge managing his courtroom. This was a man making an example of someone he didn't think belonged in front of him. Jasmine stepped forward, calm but assertive, her heels clicking once more as she stopped at the podium. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was pulled into a classified briefing regarding—" But she didn't get any further. Pearson slammed the gavel down with a ferocity that felt performative, theatrical, like a magician demanding silence before a trick. "Save your excuses," he barked, voice now dripping with contempt. "I don't care what imaginary emergency you think justifies this." Murmurs started in the gallery, then went dead silent. Jasmine blinked once, but didn't flinch. The insult was sharp, precise. He had just labeled a federal oversight call on human rights abuse as an imaginary emergency. Not out of ignorance, but out of deliberate disrespect, and everyone watching knew it. She tried again, slower this time, steadying her breath. "This was a federal matter, prison conditions. And this, he snapped, cutting her off again, is a courtroom, not your press conference. His hand hovered over the gavel like a trigger finger. You're 5 minutes late. I don't care if you were curing cancer. That's contempt. Then with a clang, the gavel struck wood again. $500 fine, payable immediately. Or I will have the bailiff escort you out, and you can explain your classified briefing from a holding cell. The threat wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about order. It was about dominance, about power, about putting a black woman with status and credentials in her place. Pearson leaned back smugly, eyes scanning the courtroom as if daring anyone to object. No one moved. Not the attorneys, not the bailiffs, not even the clerk. It was the type of silence that came from long conditioning, from people who had watched too many others be punished for too little. Jasmine's face remained neutral, but inside something was boiling. She had seen this before. This exact moment 100 times when she was a public defender. The scolding, the dismissal, the performance of legal authority when the real goal was humiliation. Only this time, it was happening to her. And this time, cameras were watching. The unfairness wasn't just the fine, it was the complete refusal to listen. The mocking tone, the presumption of arrogance. Jasmine Crockett wasn't being treated like a member of Congress, or even like a citizen. She was being treated like an inconvenience, a problem, a warning to others. Pearson didn't want order, he wanted obedience. And he wanted the courtroom to see it happen in real time. He wanted the reporters in the back to write about her disgrace. He wanted the younger attorneys present to learn one thing. If he could slap down a congresswoman, he could slap down anyone. And yet Jasmine didn't yield. She didn't shout or beg. She stood with a stillness that came not from fear, but from the discipline of someone who had spent her entire career walking into rooms where the odds were never in her favor. She didn't just see Pearson's actions as rude. She saw them for what they were. The weaponization of the bench to punish presence, to punish voice, to punish a woman who dared walk in late, but not bowed. The gavel's echo had barely faded when Jasmine straightened her posture. She didn't flinch. She didn't so much as blink. While most people would have withered under the weight of public embarrassment, especially from a judge in his own courtroom, she did something that turned the air electric. She stood still. But it wasn't a silence of surrender. It was a silence of calculation. Her eyes didn't burn with fury. They narrowed with clarity. And as Judge Pearson leaned back in his chair, with the arrogance of a man convinced he'd won the room, he missed the quiet shift in power. Because Jasmine wasn't done. She had absorbed the blow, measured the damage, and now, with the calm of someone who had seen real injustice up close, she leaned forward just slightly, enough for her voice to land in every corner of the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, her tone even, "since we're speaking of decorum, I feel compelled to remind this court of Canon 3B5 in the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct." There was no bravado in her delivery, just surgical precision. It clearly states that a judge shall perform judicial duties without bias or prejudice. That includes bias based on race, gender, political affiliation, and yes, professional status. She let the words settle, not like dust, but like lead. Every syllable landed with the force of precedent. You didn't ask me a question. You didn't allow me to explain. You issued a $500 fine without hearing cause. That is not maintaining order. That is retaliation. A breathless stillness overtook the room. Jasmine wasn't grandstanding. She was testifying, and not to a jury, but to history, to the very idea of justice that this courtroom was supposed to represent. Pearson sat motionless, but his eyes betrayed him. The lines on his face hardened. His jaw tensed. A single twitch in the corner of his mouth revealed that he had not expected her to fight back with law. He had expected nerves, maybe anger, but not cold, articulate defiance armed with judicial codes. "Are you alleging this court is biased, Congresswoman?" he asked, the word Congresswoman loaded with venom. Jasmine's reply came without hesitation. "I'm stating that this courtroom has a documented pattern of punitive overreach, and your reaction to a 5-minute delay only confirms it. Your record speaks loudly, Judge. I'm simply amplifying it. Behind her, someone shifted in their seat. It wasn't a restless move. It was the involuntary twitch of someone witnessing the exact moment the air changed. Pearson tried to regain footing. You're skating dangerously close to contempt. Again. His voice was more cautious now, as if feeling the edge he'd been walking. Jasmine didn't move. And you're skating dangerously close to a violation of your oath, she replied. Canon 3B5 exists for a reason. It's to protect this courtroom from becoming an extension of a judge's personal resentment, from turning legal procedure into personal punishment. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice cut sharper than any raised tone could. In the corner of the room, a young intern for the Dallas Public Defender's Office scribbled furiously into a notebook. It would be the most important note she'd ever taken in law school. Still, Pearson tried to hold his ground. You're lecturing a judge about the law in his own courtroom? Jasmine nodded. When that judge forgets the law applies to him too. Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. A sharp inhale passed through the gallery. Not a gasp of outrage, one of release. Like the collective realization that someone had finally said what everyone else had been too afraid to. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a public servant or a woman defending herself. She became something else entirely. A mirror. And Pearson, for all his decades of experience, finally saw his own reflection, and it wasn't noble. It wasn't dignified. It was angry, petty, and now exposed. The room was still. So still, it was as if even the air had stopped to listen. Judge Pearson sat high above, draped in the weight of his own authority, gripping the edges of his bench like a captain clinging to the helm of a ship he didn't yet realize was sinking. He had delivered his blow. He'd expected her to retreat, to shrink, maybe to protest with indignation or flustered excuses. But what came next wasn't a defense. It wasn't an outburst. It was an indictment, delivered with the controlled cadence of a seasoned litigator who knew exactly what she was doing and who she was dealing with. Jasmine Crockett stood steady, the very embodiment of restraint under fire, and spoke with a clarity that cut through every ounce of tension thickening the courtroom. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm but edged with unshakable steel, let me be unequivocal. I will pay the $500 fine today. I will not argue the penalty. I will not delay its resolution. She reached into her bag and removed a slim, labeled envelope, sealed and addressed to the clerk. The movement was simple, but in that moment, it had the impact of a declaration of war. Her fingers were precise, intentional. She placed it on the podium and slid it forward. Here, she said plainly, is my immediate compliance with your ruling. But understand this, my compliance is not agreement. She paused, eyes fixed on Pearson with unflinching resolve. Because while I am willing to respect this court, I am not willing to tolerate its misuse. So along with this payment, I will be submitting a formal complaint to the Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct. And unlike your ruling, mine will be backed by evidence. Her voice didn't rise, but the force behind it filled the room like thunder rolling low before a storm. Pearson's face began to change, not with shock, but with that flicker of disbelief that crosses a man's face when the rules he's always bent begin to bend back. His grip tightened, his lips parted, searching for a retort, a warning, a dismissal, but none came, because she had left him no room. Jasmine leaned in just slightly, not as a show of aggression, but as if to narrow the space between truth and power. I will not let your contempt for me become precedent for how others are treated in this room, she said, her words deliberate, like chiseled stone. This court is not a personal arena. It is not a place where professional stature is used to provoke and judicial power used to punish. But today you tried both. And unfortunately for you, this time, someone is documenting it. There was no applause, no reaction from the courtroom. Just a silence so thick it became its own form of pressure. Even the bailiff looked downward, unsure whether he was witnessing a confrontation or a reckoning. Jasmine stood tall, eyes unwavering. I've seen what happens when power goes unchecked. I saw it as a public defender in Dallas County. I saw it when teenagers were sentenced harshly for minor offenses. I saw it when mothers were silenced before they could explain why they missed court. And now I've seen it here, from you, cloaked in robes and rhetoric. Her hands remained calm at her sides, but her presence had grown, eclipsing even the bench. You can wield your gavel, you can hide behind protocol, but you cannot shield yourself from review. Not anymore. Not in this era, not in this state, and certainly not from me. She didn't blink. She didn't stutter. She let the silence hold, not as a pause, but as a statement, one louder than any shout, a message that resonated beyond the walls of that courtroom. Pearson sat back, robbed of his script, his rhythm, his control. And Jasmine had done what no contempt charge could ever silence. She had redefined the balance of power in the room, not through rebellion, through resolve, through law, through truth spoken without fear. And as she stepped back from the podium, envelope still resting quietly beside her, it became clear to everyone watching. The judge had tried to make her an example. Instead, she had become a precedent. But Jasmine didn't stop at a fine or a complaint. That was just the surface. What she said next shifted the entire energy of the courtroom, from a personal confrontation into the first strike of something far larger. Her voice still calm but now laced with something colder. Conviction sharpened by data, cut clean through the heavy air. This isn't just about me, she said, eyes fixed on Judge Pearson, like a spotlight that refused to dim. This is about a pattern, one that has gone unchecked far too long in this courtroom. She paused, letting the weight of that sentence hang. So I'm not only filing a formal complaint, I will also be initiating a full-scale data review of your courtroom history. Motion denials, contempt citations, sentencing disparities, all of it. She stepped closer to the microphone, her tone now unshakable. I've already assigned a legal research team. We'll be requesting transcripts, examining case outcomes, and identifying whether this courtroom has become less a place of justice and more a chamber of punishment. Pearson's expression twitched for the first time, tightening not out of rage, but calculation. He recognized the words for what they were, a roadmap to his undoing. Jasmine didn't flinch. We will analyze your rulings for evidence of disproportionate sentencing, especially against younger defendants, public defenders, and minorities. We'll track how often objections are overruled, how often hearings are fast-tracked or denied without due process. Her tone wasn't speculative, it was prosecutorial. Because when judicial power becomes predictable in its bias, that's no longer discretion, that's systemic abuse, and it must be exposed. The gallery sat frozen. Even the court reporter had slowed her typing, her fingers visibly trembling as they caught every word like pieces of evidence. I will bring the numbers, Jasmine continued, her voice a slow rising drumbeat, and with them, the stories behind those numbers. The defendants humiliated for speaking out, the attorneys silenced for defending too hard, the single mothers who walked in for traffic tickets and walked out in handcuffs. Each example hit like a blow to the ribs, targeted, real, unforgettable. And once the picture is complete, I will not just hand it to the commission, she said, narrowing her eyes. I will place it into the hands of lawmakers, oversight boards, and every journalist in this state. We will make the invisible visible. We will make the quiet pain loud. Judge Pearson sat frozen, his fingers twitching slightly on the handle of his gavel, but he didn't raise it this time. The confidence that had radiated from him only moments ago now seemed to flicker like a dying bulb. His cheeks flushed, not from exertion, but from something far more dangerous for a man like him. Surprise. For decades, he'd ruled from that bench like it was a throne, delivering sentences like edicts, challenging anyone who dared speak without trembling. But now confronted by a woman who not only stood her ground, but wielded the law better than most he'd ever faced, Pearson found himself exposed. He hadn't expected her to quote Canon 3b5. He hadn't expected her to come armed with not just facts but strategy. She hadn't shouted, hadn't postured, and somehow that made it worse. Jasmine had spoken with calm precision, and that precision hit harder than any outburst could have. And now, with the eyes of the room on him, Pearson realized something horrifying. He had nothing to say in return. He opened his mouth once, just a shallow intake of breath, as if he'd found the beginnings of a retort, but no sound followed. There were no legal loopholes to hide behind, no obscure court procedure to weaponize. The rules he had relied on for so long had just been turned against him, recited word for word by someone who knew them better. He glanced toward the clerk, then toward the gallery, but there was no rescue waiting, no ally in the crowd. Even his own bailiff looked like he didn't want to make eye contact. The courtroom had shifted. He could feel it. Where once he had commanded fear, now there was doubt. Jasmine hadn't just challenged his authority, she had cracked its foundation. And in that quiet, brutal moment, Judge Harold Pearson understood. He had picked the wrong person to make an example of. The judge's weak defense barely hung in the air before Jasmine stepped forward again. This time not to shield herself, but to shatter the illusion Pearson had so carefully built over decades. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years, hers and everyone else's, crushed beneath the gavel that sat so comfortably in his hand. "You say you apply the law equally," she said, tilting her head slightly, disbelief lining every word. "Then explain the string of young defendants you've held in contempt for speaking before you called on them. Explain why your harshest sentences are disproportionately handed to black and brown teenagers with public defenders who barely get a word in before being shut down." She turned slightly, addressing not just the judge now, but the entire room. "This courtroom has a reputation, and it's not for fairness. It's for fear, for humiliation, for reducing people into cautionary tales so you can perform dominance behind a bench." Reporters in the gallery were no longer just taking notes. They were capturing history. Jasmine continued, voice unwavering. "I've watched the footage. I've reviewed the transcripts. And what I've seen, what others have experienced, is not law. It's punishment disguised as process." She didn't speak for herself anymore. Her posture, her tone, her precision, everything radiated the presence of someone carrying the voices of thousands. "I'm not here because I was 5 minutes late. I'm here because I refuse to let this room treat me the way it treats so many others, silently, shamefully, and without recourse." Pearson's face twisted, his authority visibly cracking beneath the pressure. He reached for the only weapon he had left. "Representative Crockett, you are this close to another contempt charge," he growled, raising the gavel once more like it could silence her truth. But Jasmine didn't even blink. "Then do it," she said, staring straight through him. "Find me again. Add another number to the pile, because every unjust ruling you hand down today only proves the very case I'm building outside these walls." Her words didn't echo, they detonated. The courtroom, once his stage, now belonged to her. Pearson's threats, once ironclad, now clanged like hollow tin against the armor of someone who had already endured worse and had no intention of bowing again. The gavel never fell again. After Jasmine's final words carved through the silence like thunder through glass, Judge Pearson remained motionless, his authority unraveling one silent heartbeat at a time. And while he sat there, visibly stunned, another force had already begun moving in the shadows of his own courtroom. From the gallery's back rows, quiet hands slid into bags and blazer pockets, not out of nervousness, but with intention. Phones were lifted just below eye level, screens tilted to avoid detection, and record buttons pressed with fingers that shook not from fear, but from adrenaline. They had all heard rumors about Pearson's outbursts before, but this wasn't a rumor anymore. This was evidence, in real time, caught not on security footage but by witnesses, by people who had watched a black woman speak truth to unchecked power and not flinch when threatened with punishment. The first clip hit the internet before Jasmine even left the building. It wasn't fancy. It was shaky, vertical, and grainy, recorded from behind a pillar by a junior legal aide who had just started her clerkship the week before. But the audio was clear. You could hear Jasmine's voice, measured, grounded, as she said, "Then do it. Find me again." The clip lasted 23 seconds. That was all it took. Within 15 minutes, it was retweeted by a local civil rights watchdog account. Within the hour, it was on the feeds of law professors, journalists, and elected officials across the state. Legal scholars started quote tweeting it with full references to Canon 3B5, marveling at the precision of her response. Public defenders posted, "I've seen that courtroom ruin people. Today, it met its match." But the true explosion came when Black Twitter picked it up. Not with rage, but with pride. Not with noise, but with strategy. By the time Jasmine walked out of the courthouse steps, the hashtags had begun stacking. Pearson Pitfall trended within the hour, followed quickly by Justice Not Ego, Gavel Check, and Crockett and Corruption. Clips were being edited with overlays, her image standing firm, overlaid with historical quotes from Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. TikTok users synced her voice to orchestral drops. YouTube commentators started releasing breakdowns within hours. Let's talk about what just happened in Dallas today. Even the morning news anchors, typically slow to respond to courtroom stories, opened their broadcasts with her line. This isn't about me being 5 minutes late. This is about power being late to accountability. It wasn't just viral, it was volcanic, because Jasmine hadn't just spoken for herself. She had spoken for every voice silenced by decorum, every truth dismissed as too emotional, every protest called unprofessional. And now those voices were speaking back, loudly, clearly, and with millions listening. But while the internet rallied behind Jasmine and headlines echoed her defiance, deep inside the polished walls of the Dallas County Courthouse, Judge Harold Pearson reacted the only way a man drunk on unchecked authority could, by tightening his grip. The very next morning, a memo was issued under his name. All media personnel were to be barred from entering courtroom 3B without direct written authorization from his chambers. No exceptions. Cameras were banned outright. Reporters who had once occupied the back benches now found themselves stuck outside the courthouse doors, met by stoic deputies who recited new security policies like trained soldiers. Due to safety and decorum concerns, they said, handing out leaflets. But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't about safety. It was about silence. The courtroom was no longer a place for public scrutiny. It had become a bunker. Pearson didn't want transparency. He wanted containment. He ordered the installation of temporary security checkpoints just outside the courtroom, an unprecedented move that created bottlenecks every morning. People were patted down. Bags were searched twice. Defense attorneys who had practiced there for years suddenly found themselves questioned at the door, their court IDs scrutinized under cold eyes. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to suffocating. The gallery, once filled with quiet observers, was now half empty, reduced by intimidation. Clerks moved like shadows, heads low, voices hushed. Pearson's courtroom wasn't functioning. It was retreating. And at the center of it all sat the judge himself, robe crisp, gavel within reach, posture upright, but eyes constantly scanning the room like a man waiting for another ambush. He wasn't ruling with confidence anymore. He was ruling out of fear that someone might capture his next mistake. Then came the speech, unscheduled, unprompted, but unmistakably calculated. Midway through a routine arraignment, Pearson pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and cleared his throat with theatrical weight. "Before we proceed," he began, eyes drifting toward the bench camera that had quietly been covered days earlier, "let me remind all present that this is a court of law, not a television studio." The room fell still. He continued, voice sharp, each word dripping with condescension. "I will not allow this institution to be used as a platform for political spectacle. Recent events have been regrettable, misleading, and frankly, damaging to the integrity of this bench." No one moved. Even the defendant standing before him looked confused. Pearson's voice dropped lower. "This courtroom is not a playground for social agendas. It is not a prop for attention-seeking theatrics. The law does not bend to headlines." He never named Jasmine. He didn't have to. Everyone understood. Every attorney in the room, every public defender staring at the floor, every clerk typing a little slower than usual, they all knew. Pearson's words weren't meant to restore order. They were a warning, a declaration that the throne was still his, and anyone who tried to question that would be met not with introspection, but with fury. But the truth lingered in the silence that followed, because even as he swung the weight of his voice like a club, everyone could feel it. Judge Pearson wasn't speaking from strength. He was speaking from a corner, and in that moment, the man who had ruled his courtroom through fear for 3 decades was no longer feared. He was simply exposed, and worse, he knew it. They met under the flickering lights of a nearly empty diner on the edge of the Trinity River, far from cameras, far from court. Jasmine arrived first, sliding into the vinyl booth without fanfare, her coat still dusted with the chill of early evening. No aides, no press. Just her and a quiet determination sharpened by years in the legal trenches. 10 minutes later, a young woman in a worn gray blazer stepped through the door, eyes scanning the room before locking onto Jasmine with a cautious nod. Moments after that, a man in his early 30s, clean cut but visibly nervous, slipped in behind her, clutching a messenger bag like it contained state secrets. They didn't greet her with smiles. They greeted her with the heaviness of people who had been carrying truth too long with no one to give it to. Jasmine gestured silently toward the booth across from her. They sat. The man, Elias, the former judicial clerk, spoke first, voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd talk about this again," he said, unzipping his bag. "But after what you did in that courtroom, I knew it was time." He laid out 3 thick folders, each stamped with dates, docket numbers, internal notes, files he should have deleted when he resigned 2 years prior. "I started keeping track because I couldn't ignore the patterns anymore," he explained. "Pearson didn't just rule harshly, he ruled cruelly, and always with a smirk." Jasmine flipped open a folder and scanned the top sheet. 5 motion denials in a single week, none with written explanations, all filed by public defenders, all involving Black or Latino defendants. Her jaw clenched, not because she was surprised, but because the data now aligned perfectly with the testimonies she'd already heard. This wasn't anecdotal. This was systemic. Beside him, the attorney, Marissa, shifted forward, her eyes burning with quiet fire. "He humiliated me in open court the first week I started," she said, voice shaking but steady. "Told me I was too emotional to be taken seriously. Said that right after I advocated for a 19-year-old client who had been beaten during arrest. He didn't care. Denied the motion, made a joke, moved on like it was a traffic violation." She paused, hands clenched in her lap. "And that wasn't a bad day. That was every day." Jasmine's eyes didn't leave her. She didn't interrupt. She let the silence after Marissa's words breathe, because that silence was sacred. It was the air that followed years of being ignored, invalidated, shut down. It was the air that came before change. Elias slid another sheet across the table, an annotated spreadsheet he'd compiled during his time as clerk. Tracked over 200 cases across 18 months. Nearly 70% of motions submitted by court-appointed counsel were denied without a hearing. Over 80% of defendants who received contempt citations were under the age of 30. Nearly all were people of color. Jasmine stared at the numbers, her fingers tightening around the page. "Did anyone ever report this?" she asked. Marissa nodded bitterly. "I did. Twice. The first one was ignored. The second time, I got a meeting with the chief judge. He told me Pearson was just old school and that I needed to develop thicker skin." Jasmine's lips parted, but no words came. Just a long, low exhale. The kind of breath you take when fury sits just below the surface, but purpose holds it still. She gathered the folders gently, like they were evidence, because they were. "You've both done more than most people in your position would dare," she said quietly. "But this isn't the end. This is the start." Elias looked up, a flicker of hope finally visible in his tired eyes. "You really think it'll matter?" Jasmine nodded, her voice firm now. "I don't think. I know. Patterns don't lie. Documents don't forget. And when this reaches the right ears, it won't be me Pearson's afraid of anymore. It'll be the truth." Outside, the city moved on. Buses rumbled, lights changed, traffic flowed. But inside that diner, beneath the buzz of old neon and over cold cups of untouched coffee, a case was building, not just against a judge, but against a culture of impunity that had silenced too many for too long. And Jasmine, she had just begun to gather her arsenal. The lights in the studio were hot, unforgiving and sharp, casting crisp lines on Jasmine's face as she sat across from the anchor, in a chair that felt more like an interrogation seat than a guest spot. The cameras were already rolling when the producer silently signaled 3 fingers down to 1. Across from her sat a respected national journalist known for hardline political interviews, the kind of host who didn't flinch and didn't let guests dodge. But Jasmine didn't come to dodge. She came to clarify, to reclaim the narrative, to make sure that what happened in courtroom 3B wasn't twisted into some sensational soundbite about a politician challenging the rule of law. She straightened her posture, not with defiance but with purpose, every inch of her body projecting control, even as the fire behind her eyes began to build. "Congresswoman Crockett," the anchor began, his voice measured but pointed, "there are critics who say what you did in Judge Pearson's courtroom was political theater, that you disrespected the court, that you crossed a line. Are you at war with the judiciary?" The question hung in the air, ripe for misinterpretation, baited and dangerous. Jasmine didn't blink. "No," she said calmly, her voice even and unhurried. "I'm not at war with the court. I respect the judicial branch deeply. What I am challenging is the abuse that's allowed to fester inside it, unchecked, unspoken, and cloaked in the language of formality." The anchor sat back slightly, caught off guard by her clarity. "What happened to me isn't unique," she continued. "It's common. What's unique is that I had the knowledge and the courage and the public platform to speak it out loud." She leaned in, just slightly as the camera zoomed tighter. Her voice grew quieter, but somehow more commanding. "Let's be honest," she said. "If someone like me, an attorney, a former public defender, and now a sitting member of Congress, can be silenced, mocked, and punished for simply being 5 minutes late, for invoking the judicial code, for standing my ground respectfully, then what happens to the people who don't have a law degree, who don't have a suit, who walk into courtrooms every day already assumed guilty for how they look, where they live, or how they speak?" The studio went silent, even the floor crew pausing their movement. The anchor said nothing. He didn't have to. The weight of her words did the heavy lifting. Jasmine's voice remained composed, but a subtle tremor of emotion underscored her next words. Not weakness, but the residue of too many stories heard and too many lives dismissed. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I never have. I'm asking for fair treatment. For me and for the kid from South Dallas who was fined for speaking out of turn. For the young woman who was called emotional for defending her client. For the elderly black man who was mocked for not understanding legal jargon." She glanced briefly toward the camera, just a flick of her eyes, and in that moment, it felt like she was speaking directly to every viewer who had ever felt powerless in a courtroom. "I don't want to burn the system down," she added. "I want to fix it before it burns anyone else." The interview ended not with applause, but with silence. Thick, reverent silence. The anchor, known for his sharp rebuttals, simply said, "Thank you," and went off script. The segment aired uncut that night during prime time. No interruptions, no commercial break. Just Jasmine, framed in raw honesty, laying out the anatomy of judicial abuse with the clarity of someone who had lived both beneath the gavel and beside the law. By midnight, the clip had gone viral, again. But this time, it wasn't just activists reposting it. It was parents, teachers, former jurors, young lawyers, retired judges, people who had spent years swallowing the quiet knowledge that justice often bent, not toward truth, but toward power. And now one voice had finally said it out loud, on camera, under lights, and without fear. She had returned quietly, unnoticed by most. Jasmine Crockett didn't come with cameras this time. No entourage, no media team, not even a notepad in her hand. Just her presence, calm, observant, deliberate. She slipped into the rear pew of courtroom 3B like a shadow at dawn, the same courtroom that had nearly cracked under the weight of her defiance just 1 week earlier. Judge Pearson had taken special care to ensure things looked normal again. The lights were brighter, the bailiffs more alert. Reporters were barred. Cell phones were banned. But there were some things he couldn't sanitize, like the feeling in the room, that eerie, metallic tension that lingered just beneath the surface, like the breath you hold before something terrible happens. Jasmine knew that feeling, and on that particular morning, she felt it return the moment a 22-year-old defendant shuffled toward the bench. His name was Leon Vasquez, a community college student, clean record, charged with disorderly conduct after allegedly raising his voice during a traffic stop. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, shoulders stiff with the kind of fear only found in courtrooms like this one. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt, slightly too big for his frame, tucked awkwardly into khakis. His public defender stood beside him, a young man Jasmine didn't recognize. Likely new, already nervous. Pearson glanced down at the paperwork, bored. "Leon Vasquez," he said flatly. "Disorderly conduct, first offense." He didn't look up. "Defense counsel, I assume you're requesting dismissal?" The attorney cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution has failed to present any credible evidence. No body cam footage, no witness statements, and no formal police report detailing threatening behavior." Mr. Vasquez merely spoke in a raised tone when asked to step out of his vehicle, which he did comply with. "We believe the charge." Pearson raised a hand. That was all it took. The attorney fell silent mid-sentence. "You believe," Pearson repeated mockingly, finally raising his eyes. "And how long have you been licensed, counsel?" the lawyer stammered. 10 months, sir." Pearson leaned back, a smug smirk pulling at one corner of his mouth. 10 months. So naturally you assume you understand the threshold of disorderly conduct better than this court does. Jasmine felt it then, that tightening in her chest, the one she recognized all too well. She shifted forward slightly, her eyes locked onto Pearson's face. Leon remained still, head bowed. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, then thought better of it. But a moment later, as Pearson continued lecturing the young attorney, Leon's right hand began to rise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. A simple gesture, polite, measured. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just raised his hand. And Pearson snapped. "You!" he barked, slamming his gavel so hard the courtroom flinched. "Put your hand down. Do not ever interrupt proceedings in my courtroom again." The sound rang out like a gunshot. Leon's hand froze midair before dropping in a panic, his face a mask of fear. The public defender turned to him, eyes wide, but before either could respond, Pearson leaned forward with venom in his voice. 30 days in county lockup, contempt of court. A silence fell so sharp it could have cut glass. Jasmine's breath caught. She looked around. No one moved. The clerk's fingers hovered over her keyboard, stunned. The bailiff blinked twice as if uncertain he'd heard correctly. Leon's mouth fell open. I didn't say anything," he whispered, barely audible. "I was just—" "You were out of line," Pearson spat, "and you'll have 30 days to reflect on what restraint looks like. Bailiff, take him." The young man didn't resist as the officer stepped forward and gently but firmly gripped his arm. His legs buckled slightly. "Please," he said, voice cracking. "Please, I didn't mean—" Jasmine rose to her feet before she even realized it. She didn't speak, not yet, but she watched every movement, her eyes blazing as if burning every second into memory. The bailiff, seeing her, hesitated. Pearson noticed too. Their eyes met, but Jasmine said nothing. Not here, not now. Leon was led away, still trembling, as the public defender stood frozen, helpless. The courtroom door clicked shut behind him, but the sound echoed through the walls like a prison gate slamming. Pearson adjusted his robe. "Next case," he said briskly, as if the past 10 minutes hadn't just rewritten a young man's life. Jasmine sat back down slowly, her heart thudding with the heavy rhythm of injustice laid bare. She didn't need a file folder. She didn't need a camera. She had just witnessed something so raw, so blatant, so cruel, it would speak for itself. And she knew in that moment, the tipping point had arrived. Word of Leon's sentence spread before the day was over. Though no cameras had recorded it, the whispers turned to posts, the posts to screenshots, and by that evening, multiple courtroom observers had shared what they'd seen. "Guy got 30 days for raising his hand," someone tweeted. "Pearson's courtroom is a trap, not a court." Screenshots of Jasmine sitting silently in the gallery went viral alongside grainy sketches and retellings. The hashtags surged again. Your Pearson pitfall, now joined by Raksh, Hands Not Crimes, and Haisha Free Leon. By midnight, over 60,000 people had signed a petition calling for Leon's immediate release and a formal review of Pearson's conduct. Civil rights attorneys began offering their services pro bono. Activists planned rallies. Local reporters scrambled to confirm the story. It wasn't just another outrage, it was a spark that lit something dormant. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an error in paperwork or a misapplied charge. This was punishment for posture, for presence, for the audacity of a young man thinking he could raise his hand to speak in a room where speaking was a privilege reserved only for those Pearson deemed worthy. And Jasmine? She was done waiting. That night in her private office, surrounded by stacks of documents and screenshots from whistleblowers, Jasmine dictated a new press statement to her chief of staff. Her voice was razor sharp. Today I watched a young man be sentenced to 30 days in jail for the crime of being respectful, she said. This isn't law. This is intimidation masquerading as order. It is not my name that Pearson fears. It is accountability. And that fear is now justified. She paused, then added, I will be filing an emergency motion to unseal and review all contempt citations from the last 3 years in courtroom 3B. I will be calling on the Judicial Ethics Commission to place Judge Pearson on immediate administrative leave. And I will be returning to court tomorrow, as an observer, as a witness, as a reminder that the people are watching, and they were. The next morning, the courthouse steps were crowded, not with protesters, but with people, quiet, present, holding signs that read, "Silence isn't contempt, and justice doesn't fear a raised hand." Inside, Pearson entered with his usual flourish. But he didn't look up. He saw the gallery was full, but the faces weren't passive, were alert, ready. Jasmine sat again in the last pew, her arms folded, her expression unreadable, but her presence loud. He cleared his throat before starting the session, but his voice cracked once, barely noticeable. But Jasmine noticed, because the winds had changed, and now every word, every ruling, every raised gavel would be watched, documented, and, if needed, challenged. The era of silent obedience in courtroom 3B had ended, and with one hand raised in fear, an entire community had risen in power. And Jasmine wasn't just documenting injustice anymore. She was leading the charge to dismantle it, piece by piece, ruling by ruling, until justice no longer depended on silence, and fear was no longer a requirement for respect. The morning after Leon Vasquez was hauled away in handcuffs for the crime of raising his hand, something began to shift, not just inside Dallas, but far beyond it. Jasmine's silent presence in that courtroom had not gone unnoticed, and by the time the courthouse doors reopened, there was a fire burning in legal circles across the state. At first, it was just murmurs, a few direct messages between former public defenders, a private email chain between civil rights attorneys who had once stood at that same podium, cut off mid-sentence by Pearson's disdain. But those whispers became signatures, and those signatures became declarations. And soon a wave of outrage, measured, legal, and terrifying in its precision, was crashing toward the very seat Pearson once occupied like a throne. Within 72 hours, over 36 civil rights organizations had co-signed a joint statement condemning the judge's systematic erosion of due process and the disproportionate targeting of marginalized defendants. The Texas Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers issued a call to action, urging its members to submit any rulings they believed displayed bias or procedural abuse from Judge Pearson's bench. One email from a retired public defender read simply, "He sentenced my 17-year-old client to 90 days for speaking out of turn. I've kept quiet for 12 years. I won't anymore." Law professors began unearthing and dissecting Pearson's published rulings in real time, highlighting patterns so clear they no longer needed interpretation, they were evidence. Meanwhile, protesters continued to gather outside the courthouse. No longer a few passionate voices, but now hundreds. Faith leaders from local churches joined hands with organizers. Students from nearby colleges passed out pamphlets titled, "Know Your Rights in Court." Former defendants who once feared returning to that building now stood shoulder to shoulder, holding handmade signs. One read, "I raised my hand too." Another, more chilling, simply said, "Pearson gave me 30 days. I was 15 inches, and still the courthouse security watched quietly, some with crossed arms, others with lowered gazes, unable to deny that something irreversible was unfolding. Inside the legal system, the gears of accountability began to grind forward, slowly but undeniably. The State Bar of Texas launched a formal inquiry, citing multiple complaints against Pearson from practicing attorneys. The Judicial Ethics Review Committee quietly reopened a previously dismissed complaint from 2016. And then came the moment no one had expected, not so soon. The Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct, under intense scrutiny and pressure from both public outrage and a flood of documented evidence, issued an emergency suspension order. Effective immediately, Judge Harold Pearson was removed from active duty pending the outcome of a formal ethics hearing. The order was cold, bureaucratic, written in the language of statutes and clauses. But to those who read between the lines, it was thunder. The summary stated that Pearson faced substantial allegations of repeated judicial misconduct, abuse of contempt powers, and demonstrable bias towards certain classes of defendants, and that continued service on the bench posed a risk to the fair administration of justice. He was given 48 hours to vacate his chambers. His docket was reassigned, his office phone was disabled, and the once mighty courtroom he ruled with fear, Courtroom 3B, stood still for the first time in over 3 decades. Pearson didn't issue a statement. He disappeared behind silence, issuing orders through his attorneys and refusing media requests. But silence did nothing to stop the tide. News anchors used phrases like, "a reckoning in real time." Editorial boards ran headlines like, "Justice finally holds the gavel." One local paper printed a front-page photo of the empty bench with a single caption, "Vacated." Meanwhile, Jasmine, who had received hundreds of emails, calls, and handwritten letters from people sharing their Pearson stories, remained focused. She wasn't interested in vindication. She was interested in reform. In her office, her staff worked day and night, building not just a file on Pearson, but a blueprint for structural change. She convened roundtable meetings with law professors, retired judges, public defenders, and victim advocates. Together, they began drafting legislation aimed at reforming judicial oversight at the state level, a bill that would not just punish bad judges, but prevent them from slipping through the cracks for years, even decades, while their misconduct ruined lives. It included mandatory bias training, a public database of contempt rulings, and independent civilian oversight of judicial conduct investigations. Jasmine called it the Courtroom Integrity and Accountability Act, CIAA, and made clear in every meeting, this was not about revenge. This was about protection, prevention, real justice. And yet, amid all the noise and movement, it was the quiet victories that struck the hardest. One morning, Jasmine opened an envelope that had been slid under her district office door overnight. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman who had once been jailed for contempt after requesting a translator in Pearson's courtroom. It read, "I didn't think anyone would ever say it out loud. Thank you for doing what we couldn't." Folded behind it was a faded docket sheet, her case number circled in red. The suspension of Judge Harold Pearson wasn't a conclusion, it was a rupture, a break in the wall. The first breach in a system that had long protected itself with formality and fear. And though he would eventually sit before an ethics tribunal, his gavel already stripped, his robe already meaningless, the deeper verdict had already been rendered, not by a judge, but by the people, in protests, in letters, in lawsuits waiting to be filed, and in the unyielding voice of one woman who chose not to be silenced, even when silence would have been safer. Jasmine never looked back. She didn't need to. The gavel had fallen, but this time it echoed on her terms. And the sound of justice finally rising was louder than anything Pearson had ever imagined. From the moment the ethics hearing was announced, the air around the Texas Judicial Review Board headquarters felt electric, charged with tension, expectation, and something long overdue. The case of Judge Harold Pearson wasn't just another misconduct hearing. It had become a symbol of reckoning. Metal detectors were stationed at every door. The public gallery filled to capacity within minutes. Reporters lined the sidewalk outside with satellite trucks and whispered updates through their earpieces. Inside, the hearing room was austere. No dramatic flourishes, no theatrics. Just a long oak table, a panel of 3 seasoned judicial commissioners, and rows of seats filled with witnesses prepared to unearth years of buried injustice. This was the day accountability would be given voice, and Jasmine Crockett, calm, composed, and unshaken, was first to the stand. She took her oath without hesitation, raised her right hand with steel in her gaze, then sat with quiet authority. The microphone before her didn't amplify anger. It amplified truth. "I am not here out of vengeance," she began, her voice firm but controlled. "I am here because I saw firsthand what happens when a courtroom becomes a stage for unchecked power rather than a forum for justice." She detailed the contempt ruling leveled against her, not for misconduct, but for presence, for daring to stand tall, speak clearly, and question a judge's behavior in his own house of mirrors. She cited specific canon violations, especially 3B5, which bars prejudicial treatment based on race, gender, or professional status. "What happened to me," she said, "wasn't unique. It was a pattern, a habit, a culture built on silence. And I am here to break that silence for everyone who never had the platform to speak." The room remained still, the gravity of her testimony sinking into the walls. But Jasmine was just the beginning. One by one, the others followed. A former public defender named Marcus Reed, now graying at the temples, stood next. "He called me boy in chambers. Twice," he said, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with buried rage. "Once he threw my motion in the trash, literally into the trash can in front of my client, because he didn't like the way I argued." Then came Elena Torres, a former clerk whose eyes welled as she recounted how Pearson regularly joked about breaking new attorneys early. She handed the panel a sealed folder, handwritten notes she'd kept in secret for 3 years, time-stamped case summaries, dismissals with no rationale, orders written hours before hearings had even begun. The panel took them without a word, their faces growing darker with each passing page. But it was Leon Vasquez's testimony that brought the room to the brink. Now free on appeal and seated in a pressed shirt and borrowed tie, Leon took the stand slowly, hands visibly shaking. "I raised my hand," he said, his voice raw. "That's it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't yell. I didn't even speak. I raised my hand because I thought that's how you're supposed to show respect in court. And for that, I got 30 days. I lost my job. I missed school. My mother cried herself to sleep for a week." He stopped, breathing shallow. Then, "I thought I did something wrong, but I didn't. He did." A hush fell so heavy that the air itself seemed to pause. One commissioner quietly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The silence wasn't just respectful, it was stunned. After hours of testimony, the panel recessed for deliberation, but no one left the building, not the press, not the witnesses, not Jasmine. They sat, together, watching the sun slant through tall windows, waiting for a verdict that could not come soon enough. When the commissioners returned, their faces gave everything away. They didn't speak with flair or legalese. The chairwoman, Judge Elaine Navarro, read the decision with the grim certainty of a surgeon holding a diagnosis. "We, the members of this ethics commission, having reviewed testimony, documentation, and first-hand accounts spanning over a decade," she said, "find that Judge Harold Pearson engaged in a systemic pattern of judicial misconduct, willful abuse of contempt powers, and sustained violations of judicial ethics codes, specifically 3B4, 3B5, and 3B8. His conduct not only brought disrepute to the bench, but inflicted measurable harm upon defendants, counsel, and the integrity of this state's justice system." The room tensed. Accordingly, this panel recommends permanent removal from the judiciary, full revocation of pension and judicial privileges, and referral for criminal prosecution under Title 42, U.S. Code Section 1098-3 for the deprivation of civil rights under color of law. And then, after a pause so sharp it made the air crack, she added, "We also support the prosecutor's recommendation for a 15-year prison sentence." The room did not erupt. It exhaled. Some wept, some hugged, some simply sat back, eyes wide, finally letting the enormity of the moment settle in. Jasmine didn't smile. She nodded once, closed her notebook, and stood with quiet dignity. Pearson, seated alone with his attorney at the far end of the hearing room, stared blankly forward, his face flushed but emotionless, like a man watching his empire sink inch by inch beneath him. For the first time, the gavel that had once been an extension of his voice was out of reach. He wasn't the authority anymore. He was the defendant. Justice didn't scream that day. It didn't shout. It whispered with power, and its echo, carried by every person in that room, was louder than anything Pearson had ever pronounced from the bench. Because justice finally had spoken, and this time it was heard. Pearson's conviction wasn't the finish line. For Jasmine Crockett, it was only the clearing of rubble, finally making room to build something better. The day after the ruling, she didn't rest. She didn't even pause. She walked straight into the Capitol, stepped into a hearing room still buzzing from the scandal, and dropped a 217-page bill on the desk with quiet finality. It was called the CAFE Act, Courtroom Accountability and Fairness Enforcement. But to Jasmine, it was more than legislation. It was a shield, a blueprint, a promise that no one else would have to face what she had faced, or what thousands of others had endured in silence. The proposal was as precise as it was revolutionary. Every courtroom in Texas would be required to maintain a public, searchable database of contempt rulings, motion denials, and judicial remarks, categorized by race, gender, age, and attorney status. Judges with disproportionate patterns would be flagged for review. An independent civilian oversight board would be created, made up of former public defenders, legal scholars, and everyday citizens. No more relying solely on bar associations or internal reviews that always seemed to vanish in piles of paperwork. Every courtroom would be equipped with audio and visual recording systems, secure, tamper-proof, and stored in an open archive. Every defendant would have the right to request a written explanation for any judgment made against them. Transparency wasn't just a buzzword in Jasmine's bill. It was mandatory, measurable, and permanent. The bill met resistance, of course. Some judges called it an overreach. Some legislators called it too ambitious. But then came the hearings. One by one, survivors of Pearson's courtroom abuse, young men, mothers, attorneys, clerks, lined up to testify. They didn't scream. They didn't rant. They told the truth, plain, measured, devastating, and every story stripped away another excuse. Jasmine's final speech before the vote was short but unforgettable. "We don't need perfect judges," she said. "We need accountable ones. We don't need courtrooms to be silent temples of fear. We need them to be spaces of clarity, fairness, and trust. If we cannot measure justice, we cannot protect it. And if we cannot protect it, we have already lost it." The chamber went quiet. Then the votes came in, and it passed. The CAFE Act cleared the House with a slim margin, then surged through the Senate after public pressure made inaction impossible. It was signed into law by the governor under a rainless sky, flanked by survivors, civil rights leaders, and a stone-faced Jasmine holding the final signed page like a verdict. Across the state, counties scrambled to meet the new transparency guidelines. Old courthouses got upgrades. Training programs were launched. Judges, some resistant, others quietly relieved, sat through workshops on bias, language, and procedural fairness. Texas, long criticized for its harshness, had just become a model of judicial oversight, and everyone knew it started with a single courtroom, a single judge, a single woman who refused to back down. And then something unexpected appeared. On the side of a legal aid building in South Dallas, an otherwise gray, forgotten wall, a mural was painted in bold, defiant color. Jasmine stood at the center, her body turned halfway toward a broken courthouse door. One hand held a scale of justice. The other was extended, not in anger, but in invitation. Around her, faint outlines of those who came before her, the silenced, the ignored, the punished, rose behind her like shadows transformed into witnesses. At her feet, painted in black lettering so sharp it looked carved into stone, were the final words she had whispered before leaving that courtroom for the last time. Justice isn't earned in silence. It's demanded in presence. No one walked past that mural without stopping, and no one left unchanged. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.